Today, I am joined by Dr. Leslie Kernisan, who is board certified in internal medicine and in geriatrics and has been practicing geriatrics since 2006. She is a clinical instructor in the UCSF Division of Geriatrics and recently wrote a book titled When Your Aging Parents Need Help. Welcome, Dr. Leslie.
Oh, thank you for having me, Michelle.
I am so excited to talk about this because a lot of us in midlife, this is hitting close to the bone. I mean, we're right in the middle of it, being the sandwich generation. Before we talk about that, could you tell me why did you get into geriatric medicine?
I went into geriatrics because I started off really interested in primary care and also in why the healthcare system, I noticed this when I started as a medical student, was tilted towards hospital care and specialty care. And I felt, didn't do a great job of taking care of the whole person and of taking care of, us as we most want to be cared for, which is for things to be caught early and in the outpatient setting. So I started off there. And then as I was studying sort of who is most in need of really good comprehensive primary care and what are the biggest challenges in primary care, it became clear that it was geriatric patients, older patients who have lots of chronic conditions, often at the same time, but also whose healthcare is more likely to be really affecting their daily life. And they're more likely to have family members involved. And I just felt like it was really interesting and rich. Plus, there are the great themes of human life that come up in geriatrics, meaning and relationships and facing your own, mortality and legacy and connections with others. And I just felt like it was medically really interesting and also really satisfying to be involved with people at this stage of their life where often family members were becoming involved and they were working their way through just really interesting challenges in a sort of social and personal and also healthcare level.
Well, there are a lot of challenges, that is for sure. And your book, I enjoyed your book.
Well,
What's
thank
so
you.
interesting about your book is how you break it down. You break it into four different parts. You have tools, and then you even have what you call downloadable cheat sheets.
Mhm.
Could you explain to us a little bit why you wrote the book and why you wrote it the way you wrote it?
Yeah. So if you don't mind, the book, I'm just going to read out the subtitle. It's called When Your Aging Parent Needs Help. And the subtitle is A Geriatrician's Step-by-Step Guide for Memory Loss, Resistance, Safety Worries, and More. Here's my copy too. And I wrote it because I was really thinking of the start of this journey, this shift, both in an older person's life and in their family's life, where and I was thinking of it especially from the perspective of concerned family members, because in practicing geriatrics, I have so often been pulled aside by the concerned family member or called and been told, I noticed this or that with my mother. I'm concerned, but she gets upset when I mention it. Could you do something about it? And I know through practicing geriatrics that although, so in general, older adults, if they're lucky enough to live a long time, most of them will eventually start to experience some declines in abilities, which means that they have to start making some adaptations and maybe accepting some help from others. And a lot of times older adults realize this and seek out the help. And then a certain number of times they don't seem to realize this, or certainly their family feels like they're not realizing that they need help that the family thinks they do. So there's, can be this conflict between the generations. And I was just really interested in that. I mean, I think in general, it's a developmental stage for older adults to start to have these changes and learn to adapt and accept assistance if it's necessary, which eventually often becomes necessary for most people. And it's a whole process for families to learn to first be, a partner, to their parents. And then some of them eventually end up really overseeing quite a lot of their parents' care. And it's such a common journey that people go on, and almost nobody is prepared for it. Older adults are usually not prepared to accept the help. And family members, even though they end up doing like the bulk of long-term care services are provided by, family members, spouses, adult children, especially daughters and daughters-in-law, but also, sons and sons-in-laws, sometimes nieces, nephews, sometimes just longtime friends. But nobody is ready for it. And when it starts, people kind of flounder around trying to figure out, like, how do I get involved? And first it's, do I need to worry? And what do I do when they're telling me they're fine? And, who do I ask for help? And so I wanted to speak to that. So the book is written specifically for that situation, which is when you've noticed something concerning, might be signs of memory loss, driving difficulties, or you're really worried about their safety, and you've made some suggestions, probably, and often your older parent has not been very receptive. And I wanted to give people a step-by-step on what to do. And one of the things that I have been doing these past several years is running a website, betterhealthwhileaging.net, and we have a podcast. And so, we have all these helpful articles, both about helping aging parents and about age-related health problems. And that has been a recurring question on the sites that people post is, I'm observing these worrisome changes. What do I do? Help. And so that was the genesis of the book, was let me break it down for you, what I would do, or a modified version of what I do. And this process is something that I've actually been teaching to families online for the last few years, and I wanted to put it in a book form.
Well,
So,
you did it perfectly, I think. I mean, it was
well,
really
thank you.
well, it was done extremely well because you have 4 different action steps. The first step that you recommend is taking stock.
Hmm.
The second step is taking aim.
Hmm.
The third step is taking action. And the fourth is taking the long view.
Hmm.
So, in taking stock, what does that look like?
Yeah. So, in taking stock, and I should also add that I wrote this with a friend and colleague, Paula Spencer Scott, who's a journalist and an elder care writer. And so, in taking stock, what we wanted to do is help people. People start off very worried, and usually the first step is to, okay, step back and first take a good look at what's going on to figure out, like, do you really need to be worried? Gathering specific information so you can convey it to your parents' doctors, other people who might help you. But taking stock is also about talking to your parent about how they see what is going on. So what I found is, because they're so concerned for their parent, adult children tend to want to jump in and do something. And what I think works really better is to first, again, take stock, like observe specific things, and also talk to your parent, not in a way that's, listen, I'm worried, you need to do this, you need to accept help, but that starts off really open-minded with, let me better understand how you see this situation, or how you see your situation right now, what's most important to you. And so earlier you were mentioning the cheat sheets. So we did create checklists and cheat sheets for the things that that experts recommend older adults be kind of checked for if you're concerned. So um, definitely checking for cognitive symptoms, symptoms of memory loss or thinking problems is really important. And so in our cheat sheet, we list really specific things that you can check off. Yes, this has been happening for a while. No, I don't see this. I'm not sure. And the idea is not to turn regular people into doctors. And, it's not that you're going to diagnose your parent by yourself, but gathering up specific information can help you, first of all, see, wow, is there really a significant problem? And turns into really useful information to bring to the doctor or someone else who can help with that next step. So we have cheat sheets for, memory symptoms, other physical symptoms, the most important safety issues that we would recommend, looking for. But then we also have conversation cheat sheets on, good ways to bring up, start the conversation, what to be careful about doing at this stage. And so that is the taking stock stage.
Well, I think that's important to have the conversation, like you said, and not talking at them
Mm-hmm.
because that's going to cause a bit of a riff, I imagine.
Yes.
And most likely, have you found that the elder parent themselves has seen this happening and they might be frightened by it?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really common scenario. So uh, we find that older adults are often resistant to help. And and it is an important question. Have you noticed other signs of memory problems or thinking problems? And again, in the book, we get really specific about like, here's what that might look like. Because if they are having memory and thinking problems, then first of all, their ability to kind of have insight into what you're observing is going to be different. But of those older people who are slipping mentally, I have found in my own experience working with them one-on-one that some of them are actually aware of it and are understandably really anxious.
Right.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I can only
people,
imagine.
everybody knows somebody who lost memory or something else and saw that it changed. And even though it can be much better than people think it can be, there's a lot of, I think, excess fear and stigma. People are understandably quite concerned about what that might mean for their future and are worried about losing control. So I think for some of them, that anxiety is real and they're partly trying to cover it up as they figure out what to do, but it's hard for them to figure out what to do because you know, certain aspects of their thinking aren't working as well. And that's what people are seeing. And then there are others who are just they truly don't see it, because
Yeah.
that's also a feature of some forms of cognitive decline. Now, I've also found that sometimes adult children are so worried about their parent. And when we go take a good look, I mean, that parent doesn't seem to be really having memory or thinking problems. They're just making choices that they're, in their right mind, we would say. And they're making choices, though, that their family really doesn't like. And if that's the case, and we address that a little bit in the book, and that's part of why we give people a list for what to check for, because if that's the case, then, then you, the adult child, need to rethink your role, because your role is not to police your parents and make them do everything that is good for them. Your role is to respect their autonomy and dignity. I mean, that's your role no matter what your parents' cognitive state, but especially if they're not slipping, they get to make choices that you don't like.
Right.
And
Right.
so rethinking, how can I still express some suggestions? Because that's what we do as family members, right? We all try to influence family members we care about. That's just life. But, how could I do that in a way that's maybe less confrontational, that feels more supportive? How can I work on myself, accepting that their life is changing and some of that might distress me, but the way to address your own discomfort about the risks you see your parent taking should not be to make them change what they're doing, unless you really think they are losing their ability to discern that and that they really might need somebody stepping in, which happens
Right.
sometimes.
Well, you brought up 4 basic signs
Hmm.
that are like red flags. Could you tell
Hmm.
us those 4 signs?
Oh my gosh. The red flags. I'm gonna have to like look to see exactly which ones. I know what they are generally, but generally the red flags we look for are driving difficulties that, repeated accidents and putting themselves or other people at risk, actual financial losses, um, uh, safety problems in the house, like, near burnings um, and things like that. Repeated emergency room visits or hospitalizations we would consider also. And I think that's them. I've actually been working on a related course, and we have that in the course too. And now I can't remember if the ones in the course are exactly because I
No,
wrote the
that's
book now a while ago, and
right, right.
I'm expanding on it. And the red flag signs, usually mean that you shouldn't delay in trying to look into it. But one of the things that, I try to convey in the book and on better health while aging is that it's generally necessary to accept at least some risk and safety. And what we find is adult children really want their parents to be as safe as possible, but there's usually a trade-off between safety and autonomy and quality of life. And so usually what's necessary is to accept that your parent is going to be at some risk. Now, how much risk is partly up to them and partly a question of whether you think they're actually still in a position to judge their risk and make that decision. But
Right,
yes, if there
right.
are red flag signs, it means that it's often ethically okay to intervene more, especially if you have seen those signs of memory or thinking problems. So that's something else we bring up in the book, actually. It's the question of mental capacity and the capacity to make decisions because that's actually really important when thinking about how urgent it is to intervene, because people get to make their own decisions, even if their family doesn't like it, unless you think that they actually are impaired and can no longer appreciate the risks that they're taking and like put it together reasonably well.
Well, then what do you do there? What do you do if their mental capacity isn't there?
Yeah, so we talk about in the book that the question of capacity. We're not attorneys, but it's important for family caregivers to at least get a basic understanding. So first of all, powers of attorney are documents that allow somebody else to step in. And often in the power of attorney, it will specify whether the other person stepping in can do so only if the older person is incapacitated or not. So it becomes really relevant. When I work with families, did your parent fill out any power of attorney documents? Do they give you permission to do things right away, or do they have to be declared incapacitated? So it's very relevant there. But what we say in the book is that the capacity is often, older adults often fall into a borderline area. Capacity is supposed to be determined for every specific decision. So somebody might have capacity to decide something fairly simple, like paying their bills, but maybe not something really big and complicated or high stakes. And to know whether or not they have capacity, they need to be assessed by a professional, So we want people to understand the broad ideas, but the idea is not that you by yourself can assess, make the definitive determination. But if it's looking like, yeah, they really keep forgetting this or that and don't seem to, they're not able to tell me, yes, I understand the risk of this would be that, and that's what I would do, then we would become concerned. Well, maybe they're starting to lose capacity for this kind of situation. Unfortunately, there's so we also in the book talk in Taking Aim about the ideal, what would ideally happen when an older person is declining and might need help, and then, what often really happens. So, ideally, if an older person is having difficulties, is slipping, might be lacking capacity, they would get medically evaluated to find out what is the underlying change in the brain or otherwise their health that is causing this. It might be temporary, reversible, it may not be. And they would also get a comprehensive social intervention, right, to provide them with some additional support without impinging too much on their autonomy and privacy. And ideally, they would get a capacity evaluation for whatever capacities you're concerned about, like their capacity to manage finances, by someone who's really trained to do it and could do it really well. The problem is that it's very hard to get that ideal intervention. And one reason is that the older parent may be reluctant to cooperate. But the other problem is that it can be really hard to access professionals who have that expertise and that time to do what is recommended as the ideal approach, for instance, for self-neglect or something like that. So we feel like it's important for people to know, like, this is what has been laid out as ideal. So you know kind of what you're aiming for, but this is often what's going to happen. And so just do your best to try to get closer to the ideal. But if it's not working, it's not you that you didn't do enough. It's not that your parent's doctor was exceptionally bad. It's that really as a society, we have not invested in setting up the supports to help older people and their families go through this
Right,
as well
right.
as we could. And it pains me to say that, because I feel like even if you had access to those experts, this would still be really challenging, right, for older
Well,
people and families, but it becomes even more so, unfortunately.
it's hard too because if somebody loses their car, they're driving
Mm-hmm.
and it's obvious that they're a danger to themselves and others, but they don't want to give up that freedom. And I
Mm-hmm.
have found older people, as soon as they give up their car, they decline quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the car is a really tough one. It is normally a really strong part of people's adult identity, but also really necessary for them to be doing, a lot of, first of all, activities that are necessary for independence, like your grocery shopping and the such, but also for, activities that give them a sense of purpose and, socializing. It is really difficult when people lose the ability to drive. So we have links in the book to resources on addressing driving. So I am working on a related course right now on helping older parents with memory loss. And in that, we have a whole lesson really going through the details of driving. Again, what it's supposed to look like. So what it's supposed to look like is the doctor does an evaluation. If their memory or abilities are really poor, they stop driving. If they have maybe some early memory loss, then they're at risk and they can continue driving, but everybody should be planning a transition to stopping driving. And as you can imagine, that may or may not work.
Right, right.
Right?
Yes, I have had many
So,
conversations with different
yes.
people, and it's a big symbol too. I mean, the
Uh-huh.
car is a huge symbol. So, let's get back to focusing
Yeah.
on the steps. So, you've taken stock, you've taken aim, and now you need to take action.
Mhm.
What happens if you want to do something and you have a sibling who does not?
Yeah. So part of taking stock is also getting input from other people who are involved. So we do bring that up earlier. So first of all, so if you have a sibling, that person, now different siblings have different levels of involvement. So what we often see is that there is, if an older person has multiple children, there is one who may be the one who's geographically closest, or may otherwise be the one who, for whatever reason, has been more involved, who takes, you know, uh, who steps forward, or is taking the lead or is getting stuck with the work, depending on, the situation and how people want to think about it. So we do encourage people when they're at that taking stock stage to ask themselves, who else, is involved? And that might even be the other parent, right?
Right, right.
Because
The
that's also
spouse
something
or
that comes up,
mhm.
is that often it's a three-way dance between the parent you're most worried about, the other one, although, we have, I also run a Helping Older Parents membership right now, and we have, some people where they're worried about both parents at the same time who seem, unaware. Um, so yeah, so ideally you've already talked to siblings before, both to see what have they observed, what are they most concerned about? And, again, before making a plan, getting a feeling of like, how is everyone seeing this, is what I recommend doing in kind of separate steps, so then you
Right,
consider that as
right.
you take the steps forward. So hopefully when you're at the point of making the plan, and we have a step-by-step worksheet, maybe, and so we have a worksheet to help people kind of break down something that's big and messy into specific next steps. So it might be that the specific next step in addressing this thing you're worried about is to have a few difficult conversations with a sibling, right?
Right, right,
Maybe,
right.
maybe that's the next step.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
if you've already found that you and your sibling are kind of like reasonably on the same page, then it's just a matter of like, well, we need to research this. Someone needs to have a conversation with dad, and and deciding who's best suited to do each.
Yes, that's good. Well, you hope that it all works out to be that way anyway, and that you're all on the same page,
Well, we do,
moving
but for
forward.
anyone who's listening who's had conflicts with their sibling, I want to say I think that is more common than all being on the same page, and that whatever tensions there have been in the family tend to flare up and get, worse. So I do encourage people to see this as an opportunity to have conversations that can feel challenging, but that are often going to pay off in less stress and conflict down the line, because often this is a journey of several years for people with
Yes.
their aging parents and their siblings navigating this. So some of what can help with siblings, if there have been some tensions or conflicts, is sometimes bringing in a third party as an expert. So we in the book talk about geriatric care managers. They are elder care professionals who are basically like professional elder care problem solvers. They usually have a background in social work or nursing or sometimes therapy. They usually are out of pocket, but many of them have experience hosting family conversations, but just bringing in someone else who can ideally meet your parents, see the situation, and convey that to everybody sometimes helps siblings get on the same page, or even just, investing in a family mediator or a few family therapy sessions to just practice some better habits at communicating over what's often a really emotional topic,
Right. Well,
for
you know
people.
what's also difficult is long distance. How can
Hmm.
you advocate for your parents when you're long distant?
Yeah. So there again, I mean, I do feel like geriatric care managers are like, one of the best kept secrets that I wish wasn't a secret, actually. Um, so again, it's hard if you are at a distance. You really need, ideally, you get to go in person yourself every now and then. That has been harder with COVID, but hopefully we're going to emerge from that fairly soon with vaccinations happening. But you also need somebody who's there who can, relay things back to you and maybe take a few steps. And so it really depends on who's around your parents and who is that support network. So some families do manage to get by with the help of a, friendly, responsible neighbor who has known their parent for a long time, or another family member, who is closer, a cousin or somebody else. But then another option is to hire, a professional, to do it. And for people thinking of that route, I would say, meeting the person there and making sure that person is a good fit for your family, is often very helpful. But that is, one option that families sometimes end up going with. And the advantage of a good geriatric care manager, so they're like any other expert or consultants. Some of them are better than others. So, get referrals and the rest. But a good one will also be really familiar with what are local support options, right? So local programs that can support your parent, local healthcare providers who might be better suited to taking the next step. They usually are familiar with the local Adult Protective Services office and have an idea of how that office might handle a report of an older person doing unsafe things or maybe being financially exploited. Um, if you need to look into hiring help in the home, right, to provide
Right.
certain
Yes.
services, or
Uh-huh.
possibly look into helping your parent move to a more supportive living situation, the local care managers, they certainly know local facilities, because otherwise, when you look at facilities, you just get their marketing,
Right. It's true.
facade,
Yeah,
right? Which is all
right.
the good stuff, which is fine. But what you want to know is, what is it really like when people live here? And a good geriatric care manager who's been practicing in the area for a few years, should have that kind of insider intel, which ends up being really helpful
That
when
is
you are
great.
working out practical solutions. So I do recommend them. The difficulty is, again, that they are paid for out of pocket and usually charge hourly. And so, that can be an
Get
expense that,
pricey. Mhm. But
yeah,
you might
but
need it. So, I wanted to ask you, Dr.
mm,
Leslie, how a lot of us in midlife have only
mm-hmm,
one child.
mm,
We've had our kids older.
mm-hmm.
How do we prepare our kid or children for when we're older and we need help? What can we do to help them?
Yeah. So that is a great question. And we've had so many questions on that side that I feel like when I have time, I'm going to write the follow up, which is like, if I ever need help, you know, with like the step by step on how to prepare and, how to make the transition. But I think, the things to do are, first of all, not have the head in the sand thinking I'm never going to need help from anyone. Hopefully you won't, but realistically, the people who never need help are either the ones who die relatively early, um, or there is a lucky minority who live to an advanced age, totally independent, and then they just like die in their sleep in bed, which is what everybody wants, but happens to relatively few. So starting off with doing, and it's hard to think about, but stepping back and thinking, okay, at some point, if someone were to help me out, have I done, the power of attorney for healthcare? Have I set up some kind of arrangement so somebody could help manage my finances if I were, and initially it's in case of an accident, right, which could happen to any of us. um, and starting to have conversations with your child to kind of, it's a little bit like grooming the successor, right? Or grooming the person to step in and like be CEO of some of your life things should it become necessary. Um, I think having those conversations and starting that preparation is what I would say. And then, it's taking good care of yourself, your health, of course, but also thinking about at what point will you start to let your child be involved, letting them know. A lot of older parents maintain a kind of lifelong history of intense privacy about their finances and about their health. And so then when their families have to step in, they are just totally lost. So, it depends on the relationship you have with your child, but even if it started off with, once a year, let me give you a little update on like the major things going on with, my health or where my finances are, just in case you ever have to help me out, and initially if it were an accident.
And passwords.
And passwords, yeah, that's another one too. So,
Yeah.
we use, like in our family, we use LastPass. But I think, a lot of the password managers now have like a emergency option, right? Where you can designate somebody who can, um, go in. And then the bigger thing is, at some point, and when we do this, but it's talking about, so, if in later life I needed more help, like what were you, sharing with your child what that might look like, right? So what past research has found is that older adults can envision many they in one study they had it was called like life-changing events. I forget what it was called. I can give it to you afterwards for the show notes. I have a healthy aging series that I wrote for Better Health While Aging a few years ago, and the last one in the set is to address your advanced planning. So,
That's
so
great.
yes,
Yes.
the first one was like taking care of your brain and mood, taking care of your physical health, looking out for certain common problems that affect the health of older people, learning to manage your chronic conditions, preventive care, and then we had advanced planning. But the things that change older people's lives are like the death of a spouse, a hospitalization, developing memory problems. And people were aware of them, but first of all, they all thought it was extremely unlikely that it would happen to them. And then when they were asked, well, how would you manage or your family manage if it happened? Those who had children were all assuming their children would do it. But then when they were asked, have you discussed it with their child? Nobody had, right? So, um, and the reason why people haven't is because it's really, I think, emotionally challenging to envision ourselves in that stage, or might require us to make, what feels like a yucky choice, like, well, do I expect my kid will take care of me, which people often don't like the idea of needing that from their child, or do I, have strangers, take care of me? Like, who would that be? How would I afford it? And since neither option sounds good, people kind of turn away. Um, so I don't think you have to have everything planned out ahead of time, but just starting to engage in the thinking for yourself and the conversations with your family would already put you much further ahead than most older adults.
Well, that's fantastic, and I really appreciate all of those tips. One of the things that stick out to me, we started talking about memory loss and how we
Mhm.
worry about our parents with memory loss.
Mhm.
And then we're kind of buttoning this with ourselves. How do we
Mhm.
take care of ourselves and prepare ourselves? So in that vein, do you know of any exercises, any tips to help prevent dementia for ourselves?
Yes. So the healthy aging checklist one on brain health covers many of those. So they are, a lot of them are things that people have already heard: not smoking, regular physical exercise, sleeping enough, ideally. One that people often don't know about is learning about medications that affect brain function, finding out if you're on them, and if you are, transitioning off of them. So for instance, we were talking about sleep. So a certain number of people in midlife are taking medications for sleep that might increase the risk of dementia, or if you start to develop it, it will definitely make your brain function worse than it otherwise would be. So I think midlife is a great time to learn about those and make the transition to learning to sleep without medication or learning to manage anxiety, through approaches that rely less on medication. Because I will tell you that it's much harder for us in geriatrics to get people off those medications when they're in their 80s and starting to slip cognitively. Another thing that people don't think about, but at some point I need to make a push to encourage them more, is actually addressing hearing. So maybe you've heard of the connection between, hearing loss and cognitive problems. So it's not clear. So there's definitely an association. They don't yet know whether treating hearing loss earlier will actually change the trajectory of dementia. But once people do develop hearing difficulties, if they're also having cognitive difficulties, trying to decipher what people are saying sucks up a lot of your brain's attention. And so then they have less left for everything else. So often people are trying to correct a hearing issue when the cognitive symptoms have emerged, but it is actually much harder to do it at that time. The longer you leave hearing problems untreated, the more that part of the brain just kind of gives up on it. And when you give people hearing aids, their brain has to actually learn to work with the hearing aid. So again, that is taxing for the brain. And so doing it in midlife earlier when you have more brain, in good shape to do it, is better. So because a fair number of people in their 50s and 60s and 70s, I mean, the older people get, the more it is, are having hearing loss, but people are often reluctant to get a hearing aid because they don't want to feel old or,
Right, right.
so they,
They
they,
think they're ugly, but they've gotten
yes,
better and
they,
smaller.
they totally have gotten better and smaller. So I feel like that's another thing that can potentially help that is often overlooked. In terms of, are there certain like brain exercises and things like that? None of them have been shown super well. Something that does probably help, another thing, is making sure that your blood pressure is well controlled in midlife. So high blood pressure can, over time, contribute to what's called vascular cognitive impairment. So a certain amount of memory problems are due to chronic small injuries to the small blood vessels in the brain that happen over time. And so, so the problem is that when people finally have dementia symptoms, usually the damage has been accumulating in their brain for the previous 10 to 20 years. So it's not clear that once somebody is older and are having memory problems, that bringing their blood pressure down makes a difference, but it probably does make a difference if people do it in midlife. So I think just midlife is a great time to kind of,
Yes.
get
And
squared away on this and like work on it.
we have
Um,
the time. We have the time right now, and that's why I find it so important that people like, okay, let's get on it. Like,
yeah.
we might have been able to have gotten away with it for so long, but now we can't. And let's
Yes, I mean,
just right the
especially once
ship.
your children are less, if you have children, if you've gotten them out of the house or it's become less intensive, that could be like a great moment to try to lay some really good foundations with your health. And again, once your children are older, maybe in their 20s or later, to start approaching them about, hey, I don't, I certainly hope this won't be necessary anytime soon,
Right.
and
But have it all
like
figured
one
out.
never knows when something could happen. And so I'm starting to do, people usually start with some paperwork. Now, what I would say about the paperwork, I've had so many people when I ask them, have you done any advanced planning? Be like, oh, yes, I did it with a lawyer 20 years ago. I'm just like,
Mhm.
that. I mean, it's not a one and done. I mean, if you have an estate plan and you wrote like a will and maybe had a trust, that's great, but you should still be regularly reviewing it to see whether you should have legal paperwork saying who can step in and make decisions for your health and for your general affairs finances. In all states, they're two different documents. But you also want to revisit along with that, what are the important things that somebody in that role should know about you, right? And so those are conversations that should be repeated at least every 5 years, I would say, in midlife, because what matters to us, or what kind of crises we might anticipate, changes over time as people's health changes. If you get a major health diagnosis, then I would say be sure to ask, what kinds of crises might come up, and think about, well, that person, my child or whoever it is who's going to be my proxy, like, you know, what kind of guidance could I give? And I encourage people that it's not about like finding out everything ahead of time that could happen and saying, here's what I want. If X, do this, if X, do that, if X, do that. That what you want is to give people, you want to give your proxy, your child or whoever it is, a foundation of values, so that then they can make decisions. So the values and your preferences are like a compass to guide them, not an exact take 3 steps this way, 2 steps that. Like nobody can do that. So there are some good guides online, which are mentioned in our article on advanced care planning, on having those conversations that again lay more of a kind of values foundation instead of because it's overwhelming if you think, well, I have to figure out every single thing that could happen to me and then
Right.
tell my kid like
Yeah.
what to do. Ideally you equip them so that they can sit there and say, so what do I think my mom would want me to do in this? And if you've told them, well, these are the circumstances under which I think I would want life support, and at which point I think it would be time to switch to a comfortable death,
Right.
Um,
Oh my gosh. Dr. Leslie, I have loved this conversation.
oh, well, I'm glad it's helpful.
So,
Sorry if it's a little
yes.
sobering. I feel like it's not always fun to hear about like what might happen in
I
your
know.
your later life.
But how
But
can people get a hold of you?
yeah, so my website is at betterhealthwhileaging.net, and we have lots of articles. We actually have a tab at the top that says helping older parents. And so if anyone in your audience is specifically concerned about helping an aging parent, or maybe interested in the course we're going to be opening soon on memory loss, that tab is where we'll have listed, our latest options for getting some extra education or support. Of course, the book, if you've been worried about a declining aging parent, or if you know somebody who has, I'm excited about the book, and I hope it will be helpful to you too. And then at Better Health While Aging, we have an email list. There are some signups or something pops up. And we do cover a variety of topics. So I just did an update on the COVID vaccinations. We do, lots of topics, but we generally just send out a helpful new article every 2 weeks. So, signing up for the email list is a good way to get a useful article about twice a month. And then, of course, whenever we are doing a Q&A session, or again, a course or something else, we usually announce it to our email subscribers as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for
Oh,
everything. Oh,
and really briefly too, we also do have a podcast, the Better Health While Aging podcast. So for anyone who likes podcasts, that would be another option. There's a tab at Better Health While Aging podcast.
perfect. Well, Dr. Leslie, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for what you're doing.